Okay, thank you so much to the three of you for being here. I'm really excited to facilitate this conversation with the three of you, and huge gratitude to everyone at the Scholars Strike organizing committee for asking us to come together and for planning these 2 days. I'm really looking forward to learning a lot from all the sessions that are being live streamed and recorded for viewing online afterwards. So my name is Nanki. I am a organizer and a healthcare worker based in Toronto. I'm a migrant settler from India-occupied Kashmir, and yeah, I'm based on the lands of the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, Wendat, and Mississaugas of Credit First Nations that are being occupied currently by the settler state of Canada. And we don't have a lot of time. We have an hour, and I know I want to hear lots from all three of you. So I just wanted to start the conversation off by grounding it in grief, to be honest. I think there is a lot of grief that everyone is witnessing and experiencing. I know Miss Gwasson and I were in a call last week where we all collectively wept, and I think that that was actually really, really important. That was in response to the west end of the city of Toronto losing its only overdose prevention site at Parkdale. And I think I want to honor grief because, to draw from Ruthie Wilson Gilmore, I think we have to really resist the normalization of organized violence and abandonment. I think we have to really deeply resist the normalization of premature and preventable death. And I think we have all been witnessing that on a mass scale, on a day-to-day basis, long before October 7th, but at a different scale, and the world being in a different place since October 7th, 2023. So, with that, I wanted to just start by asking you all to introduce yourselves, who you are, what communities you belong to, or, feel accountable to. Which Freedom Flotillas did you participate in and when? Because I know that a lot of the conversation today is about practicing refusal, and I think folks probably want to ground the conversation in knowing that knowledge. Whoever wants to go first. Okay, you're all going to be really shy, so I'm going to have to just call on you. Okay. Okay. Yiping, why don't you start?
Okay, yeah. My name is Yipeng. I was born in China and briefly grew up in a place called Japan and grew up later in Waterloo, Ontario. So that's where I'm calling in from right now. Um, but I currently live and work in Ottawa, which is on unceded, unsurrendered Algonquin Anishinaabe territory. And I work as a family doctor and I practice refugee health and family medicine. I've also studied the colonial and structural determinants of health in the context of so-called Canada, but also in the context of occupied Palestine. I had the privilege of being on the Handala Freedom Flotilla for literally a few days to support the team. It was all kind of as others know, it's kind of a chaotic situation in organizing these flotillas. I wasn't meant to be on the boat, but was there to kind of support the team. But the opportunity came up to be on the boat for a few days, and so that was my experience with the flotilla team, and have been in touch with them since.
Miss Gwasson.
Hey, I'm Miss Gazan Agnew. I am Korean Dene, a member of Salt River First Nation. I was born and raised here in the city of Toronto. I'm just at the Street Health OPS right now, just taking some time to have this conversation. So please don't mind me if there's folks kind of in and out of the background. Um, yeah, I work in harm reduction. Um, I work at the Street Health OPS as a relief staff. And I also work with Toronto Indigenous Harm Reduction, and abolition really informs a lot of the work that I do. Um, and I think that Palestinian solidarity work has been so important to me in the past 2 years, especially. And I'm really glad that I have the opportunity to link all of these struggles together. So I'm glad that we're having a conversation about that today.
Hi, guys. I'm Suzanne Shush. I am Sudanese on my father's side and Coast Salish through my mother's side. I'm a member of the Khmer First Nation in British Columbia. My upbringing was in Alberta in Treaty 6 territory, and I was incredibly lucky to be a part of the Freedom Flotilla with Miss Blossom for the first portion of that voyage, and also with Yi Ping on the Global March to Gaza. So it's like a ongoing effort in refusal to accept the conditions that are being imposed and forced upon us by people who hold power who shouldn't, and their laws don't mean anything. And I really appreciate and love the absolute refusal to be scared, to be intimidated, to accept no for an answer, and to engage in direct action with like these two absolutely incredible people here. So thank you for having me.
Thanks, Yael. Okay, so I've kind of had two big framing questions, and I'm sure that through the conversations, there'll be lots more that we can chew upon and talk about. So I wanted to just start by, recognizing that the systems that have been created by settler nation states and global imperial powers are operating as planned. We know that international law, Western democracies, mainstream institutions, including healthcare, education, prisons, policing, all of these structures are being created by and for those who benefit from the ongoing occupations and exploitation of indigenous land, resources, people across Turtle Island, across Palestine, from Sudan to Kashmir. And we know that one of the key ways people have always resisted imperial violence is through non-cooperation. And I think, it's been ordinary people that are resisting um, to abide by unjust laws. They're resisting to continue to, not engage as if the status quo is okay and that engage in ways that resist their own institutions and the law, like the policies that their own institutions are imposing on them. And I know that, of course, I think Palestinian healthcare workers come to mind right away. I think from the very beginning of this genocide, that has been such a key point for so many of us that are health/care workers to really see the level of commitment to their institutions, to their physical location, to their people, to their patients, to the land, despite the risk of annihilation and ongoing attempted annihilation. We see that with Wet'suwet'en land defenders that are resisting man camps and pipelines through the territories. We see that with the Sudanese resistance committees that have been engaging in civil disobedience from, the revolution 2019 onwards. We see that with harm reduction workers across Turtle Island that have been creating life-saving mutual aid services like unsanctioned, i.e. illegal, overdose prevention sites. And of course, all three of you just talked about how you participated in the global effort to break the siege on Gaza through the Freedom Flotillas. So I wanted to open up the panel by asking you what inspires you, what makes it possible for you to actually practice refusal? Because I think it's important to be able to ground the conversation in the everyday ways that we build courage in our lives. I'm not going to call on your names each time, so y'all just need to fight for the mic and unmute yourselves.
I just keep waiting for Miss Guasan to answer every single question because I love listening to Miss Guasan speak, and you too, Yuping. Okay, but I will start because I think that when you think about non-cooperation, non-cooperation with a system that is so structurally successful in oppression, and we think about the system of settler colonialism, which is harmful on everybody. It's not just harmful on Indigenous people. But the more and more I've been thinking about this, we think about, settler colonialism is creating a system in which indigeneity is actually erased completely. And that means for the Indigenous person who's criminalized, who's killed, who's genocided, but it also means for the settlers who are ripped out of wherever they should be Indigenous, and they're not Indigenous to the land that they then begin to live on. To be Indigenous, like we say, is to belong to the land. It's not having the land belong to you. And when we have a world in which there's nobody who's Indigenous, nobody knows how to live with the land, cooperate with the land, work with Mother Earth in a way that actually allows Mother Earth to thrive, to be sustainable, to be safe, to be sufficient, to provide a bounty of life for everything that we should be able to. We just see these systems of extreme exploitation. And that's what capitalism is. It truly is the relentless rape and pillage of Mother Earth because we've severed our own belonging to the land. And I think that when it comes to myself, you know, I definitely have two very strong-willed parents. My father was a political writer, constantly criticizing dictatorial governments in Sudan. And my mother is just an absolute cooperation like role model, who I always joke has the four pillars of, or the three pillars of land back, fuck the police, and free Palestine as like the starting point for what you're going to work with when you're thinking about morals and how they guide you. And we really know that there's no incidents in which Indigenous people here on Turtle Island are not and never have been just passive recipients of settler colonial violence. There has always been resistance. There has always been um, the struggle to survive in Indigenous solidarity. And resistance can mean a lot of things. There's the armed resistance, and then there's also the resistance of staying alive. There's the resistance of taking care of each other. That's the resistance that we're seeing in Sudan through the neighborhood resistance committees and the community kitchens. And that's what we've seen through here when through non-cooperation, we don't expect to be in a world where our government actually will take care of us. We take care of each other and we keep us safe. And that's something that I was raised very, very aggressively to know. And I'm also raising my children to know that. And just thinking about all of the ways in which resistance is needed and being Indigenous is actually needed in order to create a sustainable life here on Mother Earth herself.
Yeah, when I think of non-cooperation, so I was with the Freedom Flotilla coalition to break the siege on Gaza aboard the Conscience. When we were intercepted, it was actually an act of piracy. It was against international law. Because the blockade and the siege on Gaza is illegal. And it's interesting because when we were taken to Ashdod and we were processed there, we were asked by the IOF, like, did you know that you've tried to legally enter an enabled militarized zone, and you've tried to illegally enter so-called Israel. And it's like, no, I didn't. You kidnapped me, and Gaza has the right to receive us at their shores, and Gaza has a right to say who comes in and out of their ports. And this blockade that you have is illegal. And so the same could be said for when CGL tried to, push through Wet'suwet'en rights and title and say, oh, you like they had permission to be there when they didn't. The Daglamac, said that the Wet'suwet'en have the say of what happens in their territory. And so I think there will always be a challenge of who makes the laws and what do we honor. And I think that in order for me to do the work that I do now, a lot of people have had to push back against what they say is the law and how it's interpreted. And we have to set, people have set precedents in order for me to do the work that I do today. And I think for the length of time that I've been organizing, I didn't start out doing the work that I'm doing now. It took me a long time to learn from people, to develop relationships with other people in order to push back. And to resist in the way that I have, because you can't do it alone. I had a lot of supports and my community to lift me up and so that we can do that work together, because it's not done alone. And I think, I've been criminalized many times for the work that I do, and it's never deterred me. And I think the more that I am criminalized for the work that I do, the less I'm afraid of it. And it just because it's so empty, because we're so powerful and we're so strong. And I think about what my ancestors have been through in comparison to the challenges that we face today. And, at times when I feel like we can't move forward, um, we've already lived through so much, and it's in our nature to keep going. And I just really look to the teachings that I've been given, um, and let that be the principles that guide me in the work that I do. Um, and for my community to hold me accountable.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, Ms. Kwasson. And before you share your remarks on this, I just wanted to, there's two things that you said that really stood out for me where, talking about how the more you're criminalized, the more it kind of just breaks the facade of these laws and their institutions. Um, Makes me, as an abolitionist, I think it's always really, really important to kind of talk about how settler colonial societies and their global imperial law structures um, have actually done a really good job to try to convince everyone that it is through their laws that people will get access to safety, when we know that those are the very laws that are actually used to enact such large scale violence. Um, and we see that with what you were talking about with regards to Israel, engaging in an act of piracy when they abducted you and getting to both rule, make, and break as they see fit. And we see how the global apparatus that is currently structured actually can't stop them, in part because it is actually created to serve them. And so I think that is really important. And I appreciate your reminder of whose laws are we following and what are the moral and ethical like compasses that we're actually carrying with us as we move forward. Yeah. Yiping.
Yeah, I was thinking about like similarly like some of the things that like my parents have taught me growing up, and something that I don't often talk about is like my dad comes from a very like humble um community, like a rural farming community, where I have an uncle that still tends the land and farms garlic, and much of the world's garlic comes from China, and much of China's garlic comes from this one province where my family, on my dad's side of the family, comes from. And he's shown me like the land. He's shown me the like building that he's like built with his own hands so that he could like study with like candlelight to be able to kind of break out of this poverty cycle with education. Um, but and I think about what would happen if people tried to like take that land by force, right? And I think about what it means to be like a settler and an immigrant on stolen land, and having learned from indigenous communities like at Six Nations of the Grand River, Haudenosaunee First Nations, which is very close to where I'm sitting right now, where they're still fighting for like clean drinking water from their taps. Or I think about the Palestinian like families that I've like stayed with and learned with from in occupied Palestine. And there are these, contradictions of even existing within a settler colonial state that is still built upon the genocide of indigenous peoples and stolen land, right? Like I was just, at the Palestine Tribunal for Canadian Responsibility in Ottawa a few days ago over the weekend, and it was supposed to take place at the University of Ottawa, and then they kicked them out because, University of Ottawa. And then instead, they were in the Senate, where this big Canadian flag was next to everyone that went up to the podium to speak. And those walls, that building, is on stolen land. So there's these really strange contradictions of how do we really push back through non-cooperation, but through like, what I think we have to really think like what does that common horizon of liberation look like? And I was also reflecting on how, the laws, right? Like laws on this land, what has happened on this land before too, including to like people that look like me, that speak the language like me, and um, Chinese migrants were used to as cheap labor to like build the Canadian Railroad, and then when that became inconvenient for the state to have so many, in their words, like too many like Chinese migrants, they imposed a head tax. And when that, didn't achieve the outcomes that they wanted, they had the Chinese Exclusion Act. And so with these like different forms of legal mechanisms to impose on stolen land who can or can't um, live a life on this land. Um, I think about, like so much work that we have to do around understanding these histories and connecting the struggles for like liberation for liberation of people, but ultimately I think liberation of the land because there are still these systems and structures that have been so normalized and created that and created in the conditions for why also genocide is happening in Gaza, right? At the hands of a settler colonial state that is propped up by all these other settler colonial states in the West. Their interests are one and the same, like capital and economic and political interests that are colonial in nature, to extract resources from the land, to exploit people as human capital. And this is, is not just the case of Palestine, is the case of many other struggles for liberation in places like Sudan and in Congo. And we're seeing like this kind of exploitation of human capital that has always existed, but we're seeing it because the world is more connected than ever before through our phones and technology. And we have access to uh, direct reporting and narratives from the people who are most oppressed and marginalized by structural violence.
Oh, I'm like having offshoot questions already, but I'm going to try and stick really hard to the set of questions I had shared with a few of you before. But I do appreciate the point you just made in terms of just how all of our unique forms of dehumanization actually shapes our fight for everyone's humanity and the importance of actually understanding where the solidarities lies and where the differences lie so that we can actually be very precise and clear in what our struggle actually needs to look like, what the strategies actually need to be. And I think it's helpful for me to kind of think about what laws we are actually following and abiding by and which ones we denounce, because I think inadvertently, particularly for all of us that are currently based within the imperial core in all kinds of different ways, whether we're part of the fourth world or, the first world, I think it's really important for us to be very clear on our strategies that we engage in that don't actually reinforce the settler societies um, hand power laws in any ways. And I think that all of you engaging in ways that actually have resisted that from all of your different vantage points has been really, really important. And I think is really important for other healthcare workers to actually see, to recognize the importance of how do you actually engage and resist in a way that actually dismantles the very core root of the settler colony of Israel, like Zionist imperialist colony of Israel engaging in genocide that is very much propped up by the Canadian state and US and Europe. So I appreciate that. I think one of the other questions that I did want to talk about is specifically kind of talking about healthcare and what we do as healthcare workers, because we know that life-preserving care services for the health of all people, and particularly Indigenous people, are always targeted by the colonial state. You know, I think whether it's through direct assault, like we've seen with Israel's targeting of healthcare infrastructure, ambulances, paramedics, hospitals, healthcare workers' homes, as we've seen across Gaza and the West Bank, or through indirect violence, like we're witnessing with the mass scale social murder, particularly of Indigenous people that are continuing to be impacted by the drug war that's fueling the overdose crisis across these territories, only going to be worsened with the shutting down of so many overdose prevention sites across Ontario. I think my question to all of you is, given this both direct and indirect forms of violence, where do we go from here? How do we, as health and care workers, however you see yourselves, that are committed to international solidarity with nations across Turtle Island and Palestine, go for here? What are the kind of actions that you're continuing to engage in now? And what are the actions that you and strategies that you hope all of us collectively start to deploy more and more of?
First of all, I just want to acknowledge that harm reduction was made by drug users for drug users. And that the current toxic drug supply that is on the streets here in Toronto is the continuation of the genocide of Indigenous people here on this land. And you could very well say that the disproportionate lack of access to healthcare here is another form of medicide akin to the blockade of medical supplies that are allowed to enter Gaza. It's different, but the root of it is the same, which is settler colonialism and occupation. So I would say that, sorry guys, I would say that one, it should be the people themselves that determined how we receive care, and it's us to say that we are the ones determine how care is delivered. I think that when Bill 223 was passed, which was the bill that closed down safe consumption sites, there was a huge lack of consultation with Indigenous community. And even when that happened, what do we mean by consultation with whom and who is considered community? You know, people think of our sovereignty in terms of like title and title over land, and very seldomly is like determinants of health considered an act of Indigenous sovereignty, right? Because like having autonomy over your own body is where it starts. And I think the dehumanization of Indigenous people is at the root of that. They don't see us as human. Even though, you know, in terms of the toxic drug supply, we are the biggest demographic of people that access safe consumption sites. We make up for the biggest demographic of people who have died because of the toxic drug supply. And yet we're the last to speak on it, and we are the smallest voice in the room. So what that means is that if we are going to truly liberate Indigenous people, that they are the ones that are being hurt, they're the ones informing you know, the resistance against the drug war. So I think that there's a lot of people who have already laid out that work for us. You know, I think of my mentors in harm reduction and the stories that they've told me about a time when they've had to smuggle naloxone over the border when it wasn't available in Canada. I think about, the like doing satellite programs and what that was born out of. And you know, people literally going to trap houses here in the city and bringing them supplies and, you know, really it being informed by people who are on the streets. I think we're in a different time now, whereas if people try to use the same tools, maybe the results would be different. I think that this current government has been really good at manufacturing a moral panic, and they're really, like somebody said to me the other day, they're playing whack-a-mole. So every, any avenue that you could take to kind of circumvent the laws that and the bills that are being passed right now are being covered. So I think it really goes back to giving people who are the first responders to a scene of an overdose the tools to empower themselves. And I think, when Bill 223 was being announced, there were a lot of harm reduction workers and healthcare workers in the city, quite literally, making sure that they were getting as much supplies as they could because we knew that there was a time coming that we would have to start going back to the days of giving out, tools illegally. And, I think about even the needle exchange program in Toronto, I think was originated 1989. So we're going way, way back. So I think we're gonna have to come up with some new, we're gonna have to be crafty about how we do it. And I think we're gonna have to take some risk, because when we see so many community health centers have obliged and made concessions in order to try to maintain any harm reduction services available in the city. And we've seen that those concessions have actually caused a lot of harm. And at some point, we do have to resist and push back and say no and take matters in our own hand. And I think be bold.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, Ms. Clausen. I think, to tie it to what you're saying on the ground in Gaza in particular right now too, it feels like all in the same. Like how do we actually uplift and support Indigenous peoples building infrastructure for themselves without reliance on nation states and outside funding that can be withdrawn, that can be manipulated, that can be taken away. And even thinking about all of these programs, the overdose prevention sites, needle exchange, naloxone exchange, all of these, like you said, Ms. Watson, came out of community of drug users caring for each other, and over time have been taken in by the state as a way of it, again, manipulating power in order to be in control. So when things become threatening enough, they are absolved into the public health model. They're taken in as an official part of the state apparatus so that they can then be extracted and shut down the minute we notice rising authoritarianism and fascism like we're witnessing right now. And so I think, non-cooperation with the state as a form of our actions and actually uplifting Indigenous sovereignty and action and obtaining, individual autonomy, whether that's on the ground in Palestine and here, makes so much sense. And I think I'm even thinking about, Yipeng, your comment around how Chinese migrants were targeted by the state when they were seen as no longer necessary, but initially incorporated into the state as a tool. I think about the 1908 Opium Act of Canada, the first official drug law that actually came out of as a result of white settler colonialists rioting against Chinese and Japanese businesses in the downtown east in BC and Vancouver. And that was the state's response. Okay, we will not allow for the sale of production and resale of opium for non-medical purposes. And the fines associated with that initial Opium Act were actually deportations, not just detention, but deportation, because it was very clearly targeting particularly Asian migrants. And obviously, we have the alcohol banning laws and all the ways, both the use of psychoactive substances and the laws that criminalize them have been used in order to engage in land theft and attempted annihilation of indigenous peoples here. And I know as as a Kashmiri, we're witnessing that on our territories back home as well in terms of how opium and other psychoactive substances are being used to also dispel resistance and find other routes of criminalizing people. So I appreciate the links that both of you are kind of making in these comments. Who else wanted to, yeah, add more?
Yeah, I guess I just wanted to, yeah, follow up because you, um, I think synthesized it really well in acknowledging like it's fascism, right? Like these are symptoms of fascism, and we are responding to those symptoms where various different communities, both here and abroad, can be dehumanized and used as scapegoats for authoritarian fascist governments to push their political agendas, to advance usually colonial agendas. And um, and what we know to be true about fascism is like no one is safe under said system, right? Like even um, like those that can be seen as part of the ruling class, like eventually different kind of forms of persecution will come for people, even through different kinds of means of oppression and prosecution. So um, I think to kind of acknowledge it as such is really important. And then I think we know that um, I think about also like the ways in which like Palestine solidarity has been like criminalized, and that has been part of the playbook of using kind of these legal mechanisms and it's really confusing to people because as we kind of talked about like what laws do we look at, and then because we're citing like international humanitarian law, right? In the context of what is legal and what is not, but it's always um, there's this lawyer that kind of had this really great statement at the tribunal. I'm trying to remember it. It's like laws are the reflection or the product of politics, but politics is something that we all have the power to change. And if we change the system so that people have a political awakening, we have a revolution in whatever means that can look like, then those laws will also subsequently change. And they have, right? They have. Like the things that have been criminalized before are no longer, but that is always this like ebb and flow thing as a reflection of where the people are at. And if the people are asleep at the wheel, which I do think is happening right now under overt fascism, then we're all less safe, and it leaves people who are the most impacted by structural violence and oppression trying to save each other's lives, right? And I think I was just thinking about, the work that, harm reduction workers do here on this land, but also what it compels someone to get on a boat to sail to Gaza. And there is a privilege component, I think, of offering your solidarity by getting on a boat and going to Gaza. And how do we extend that same solidarity to our own community members, our own neighbors that are experiencing the same forms of structural colonial violence? And only when we can recognize it as such will we ultimately put our own bodies on the line to protect them and protect each other. Ultimately, it's about protecting oneself, and what it means to be human and seeing someone else as human, fully human. And that's the basic thing that I think really destroys fascism is to you see the humanness in the other, and you also acknowledge there is no other. It's like an us, a we. And the ways in which like the division is caused is a symptom of a fascist, authoritarian state that has certain interests in mind, and it's certainly not the thriving and flourishment of its people. Um, but but it's about survival, right? We like people's non-cooperation with the state starts with survival. And for people who are not in that space of surviving versus not, we have to recognize that people are dying from these policies. And to be in solidarity means you get in the way, and whether it mean getting on a boat or doing harm reduction work or doing so many different other forms of solidarity work that is necessary to protect communities from fascism. I'll just leave it there.
Yeah, all of you sharing your thoughts just like makes my brain bounce in so many different directions and all the connections you're making. Like I think to both of the comments that you made, of course, we've been hearing this saying that Palestinians are freeing themselves and freeing the world, the rest of the world along with them. And I think that heart of that to me is that Indigenous people have always existed under fascist conditions from the origins of these settler societies. And I think it makes sense that the solutions to resist rising fascism and authoritarianism comes from Indigenous resistance and learning from Indigenous resistance across the globe. And that resistance, including not just resisting in opposition to settler society, but actually thinking beyond the settler society of what care actually looks like. If we think about criminalization as the most antithesis to care, then how do we actually start caring for one another in order to actually end the cycle of criminalization that the state continues to impose on people that they deem not human, you know? And when in terms of the comment of like what laws do we follow, I'm thinking about, Wisconsin's comment on Wet'suwet'en laws. I'm thinking about the Dish with One Spoon treaty that I live on and the treaties that I live on. I think about the laws of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. I think about the host laws that I should actually be fully knowledgeable about that should then, dictate my presence on these territories. Um, and how do we actually uplift those laws, whether as opposed to the laws of a settler society? What are all the ways that we're actually making that settler society obsolete through our actions? And I think building care models with each other makes so much sense, which I will flag a resource by interrupting criminalization at some point that actually helps us map out what care looks like within our communities and how we can actually do that work. But Suzanne, I'll let you speak.
Yeah, I know I'm listening to everything. Honestly, it is number one, we live in a country where Indigenous people remain to this day not human beings under the law. The only reason that land claims can be settled in the Supreme Court in both Canada and America is using the actual doctrine of discovery and the papal bulls of Terra Nullius, which literally say that Indigenous people are not human beings. They are the same as a tree or a deer or a moose. There is no rights, there is no inherent sovereignty that Indigenous people should have. So this is still standing law. This is how, like, this is, it is crazy to hear Musclosson and everyone speak about, people being driven to do illegal, to practice illegal healthcare when we are, you know, criminalized by laws that are not even based in science. Like there's no evidence whatsoever to shut down OPS sites or to restrict harm reduction. In fact, there should be an OPS site and harm reduction available in every single community across the country. Imagine we only had diabetes care available in one tiny corner of one tiny city. Everybody who is diabetic would have to be there. This is absolutely insane to think about, looking at the law. What does that mean? Every single law in this country, just like in Palestine, has been created without the consent, with the explicit non-consent of Indigenous people, the explicit non-consent of Black people. And these are the laws that the police enforce. When we talk about like defunding and abolishing the police, this is such a critical element because we will never have effective liberation movements as long as the police can oppress us. And they're able to enforce laws that reinforce racial hierarchies that make liberation struggles very, very difficult to fight, right? And I think about things like, Ms. Boston mentioned like the meticide here on Turtle Island and the meticide in Palestine. And I think that we think about things that we've seen in Palestine that seem unprecedented. And, meticide, ecocide, domicide, scholasticide, sophicide, language that people are making up at this point to explain the complete eradication and elimination of a people. And that's what our ancestors here went through. And that's what a lot of our ancestors continue to go through, what a lot of our relatives continue to go through here. The erasure of them as human beings, the erasure of their access to healthcare, the erasure of their access to dignity, sovereignty, human rights. I think about, the idea of risk, which is something that Ms. Wasson often talks about. And I don't feel that I'm ever in a place where I can claim to be putting myself at risk. I'm an incredibly privileged person. I'm a physician. I have a lot of power, a lot of privilege. And I think that without having a mentality from the beginning of non-cooperation, you just continue along with the status quo. And I think about this like, when I was up north in 2011 to 2012, I learned about naloxone. This is just an example from drug users and how it saved people. And when I came back to the city, we weren't using it in shelters, and it was very hard to get shelters to even accept it. And then I went to public health and I just told them, I will literally write a medical directive and take personal responsibility under my own license for naloxone to be used across the shelter system. You can take away my license if anything bad happens to anyone. And and then they did accept this to start bringing, like you can actually do things, you can make changes. You do not have to be passively accepting of the circumstances that we're looking at right now. And I think that's what Palestine really highlights, is that people are looking at this horrific circumstance of immense preventable death and starting to say, why is this happening? Why are we allowing this to happen? And then it's like, why are we allowing it to happen to drug users? Why are we allowing it to happen to incarcerated people? Why are we allowing this to happen in Kashmir? Why are we allowing this to happen in Sudan? Why are we allowing, it starts to unravel all of this power structure. And that is a very, very beautiful thing. That starts to make people realize I don't have to cooperate with this system. Like, why are things the way they are? All of a sudden, people are questioning the use of brand new cell phones, understanding sacrifice made. And it's not even a sacrifice, understanding the horrors inflicted on people in order for us to have our luxuries. And so I think about, the awakening and the realization nothing has to be this way. We can actually do something about it. You watch a country completely weaponize aid as a weapon of war and genocide, and that goes unchallenged. Every single government, except for possibly Yemen. And then you have these direct actions where people like Yiping and Ms. Wasson, and we're doing anything that you can do, and anyone can do a direct action. By the way, the first time I went to take aid to Gaza to break the illegal siege, which our government should not be enforcing or allowing, and we should not be doing this, and aid will never end a genocide, but you still have to do something. um, I went with a very good friend of mine, and we were just getting aid through with physicians like Yiping who go into Gaza, packing their vans, packing their trucks, bringing in hundreds and hundreds of kilograms of aid. And at the same time, we just literally held a 24-hour fundraiser for Sudan and raised 10,000 US dollars and bought expensive equipment that we were able to send through to Sudan that they could not afford. And this was something that we just, the world does not have to be this hopeless place where you can do nothing. It is a pretty hopeless place. And most of the stories are not feel-good stories, like getting, 10,000 US dollars of aid into Sudan. That's not a feel-good story. That's actually really depressing. Getting, a van full of aid into Gaza is still depressing, because we need so much more. But we start to see these unravelings of power. And when you have power, you should use it. I try to use it. I hope I try to use it. Sometimes nobody's perfect and I always make mistakes, but the power and the privilege that we have and the ability to just build something different, and to redefine the healthcare worker, to redefine why, in all of our systems today, nobody has been able to meet the needs of Indigenous people who are facing immense premature and preventable death. So why are we still classifying the only healthcare workers as the ones that go to the universities that have continued to reinforce the status quo? This is why we need our peer reduction, our peer workers, our people with lived experience. We need our harm reduction workers, and like Ms. Kwasson said, they need to lead the way because they know what they're doing. We don't know what we're doing, otherwise we wouldn't have this problem, or what we're doing is part of the problem. So I think that there's like a lot to be learned from just being foundationally non-cooperative. I think that that's like a really, I like that phrase that you use, Mackie. For some reason, I feel like that's like new to me, and I was like, ooh, I like this non-cooperation.
Yeah, and I feel like Suzanne, you're touching on this like important aspect of the fact that we exist and all of us have relative access to power within settler society based on our positionalities and all the axes of, class, race, immigration status, and whatnot. And I think that one of the things that abolitionists have taught me in particular is just the importance of engaging in non-reformist reform. So engaging in actions that collaborate with the state in ways that actually strips power away from it rather than solidify power within it. And so finding ways to get money and resources out of the formal structure and systems into communities' hands, like you did with getting Noxone into the shelter system, that makes so much sense to me. It's not reinforcing it. It's not letting, Toronto Public Health be like the beacon of Narcan distribution versus actually tangibly getting that Narcan into people's hands. And I think about that in particular because, we're talking about healthcare. We're talking about the fact that terra nullius is used, this idea that the land was barren and therefore not actually inhabited by humans as deemed under your Christian ideology. And we know that a healthcare system across so-called Canada facilitated that enactment of terra nullius, right? It's like it was colonial doctors meant, three of us that actually participate in that and continue to be part of that institution that actually detained people for at risk of communicable diseases, engaged in forced and coerced sterilization and continue to do so, remove people into so-called Indian hospitals. We know that that has existed. That is the institutions that we're actually engaging in. That is all part of law, that existed as part of law. We have the Forced Sterilization Acts in BC and Alberta that existed well into their, I believe even to their 1960s, right?
Can I just say the laws that are against sterilizing Indigenous women passed in March of 2024?
This is what I'm saying, right? And like now they're creating laws in order to undo the laws that the settler society actually was abiding by for decades and decades and decades. And so I think what's been really helpful for me to remember is that where does our allegiance lie? And are we always engaging when we are part of the formal healthcare system through that framework of non-cooperation and through that framework of non-reformist reform so that we're actually taking power and resources out from within those institutions and into the hands of communities. I think Ms. Gosson talked about people, and particularly harm reduction workers, actually taking supplies out of institutions because we know the state is going to get rid of them. We've seen that happen at one of the institutions that I work in. And so I think that that makes a lot of sense as a real key ethical framework for us to continue to work with. Yeah. Any parting words? We have a few minutes left, so thoughts?
I just want to say to the three of you, in doing the work that I do, you know, I think it's really beautiful the work that we do together, because I need you and you need me. And like, even the work that I do with Suzanne in Palestine Solidarity, we carry that same relationship and the work that we do in the streets of Toronto with their own community. And it's very much a collaborative thing. And I think that it's it gives me hope, that despite all the measures that are being taken to dismantle all the work that's been done by people who have come before me, I do know that I can pick up the phone and call somebody should I need to get somebody on safe supply. I know I'm going to find a way, even though all these measures have been taken to dismantle that I can still, reach out to people in community through, not just like institutional structures, but through organizing work with, people from all walks of life, that we will make it happen. So I'm just grateful for that. I just wanted to express that gratitude, and that all of these principles that guide me in my work translate to
all of the organizing spaces that I am, whether it be abolition of the police or, getting on the conscience and trying to break the siege to enter Gaza, or even, just meeting someone and trying to get them on safe supply, like all of these things, they're all interconnected. And I'm really glad that we could have this conversation and draw those pathways for people to really understand how that works.
Yeah, thank you, Ms. Glosson. I feel like, so many people have said this to me, and so I repeat it over and over again. I think our movements are only as strong as the depth of our relationships, and I think that's really truly what you're speaking to. And I look forward to continuing the legacy of all those that have come before us and caring for each other, really weaving the work of caring for each other into our community self-defense. Yeah. So thank you all. I think we're going to wrap up. Oh, there was a
Thank
reason.
you.
Interrupting criminalization. It's called Block and Build, but Make It Abolitionist. That's online. And I think they also have a mapping community ecosystems of collective care. It's a toolkit that you can go through within your own community of folks and kind of just write down what exists, what doesn't exist, what do we need to build next. So shout out to the folks on the other side of a colonial border doing that work.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for this. It was so good to be with all of you and to know that we'll be doing this work together. It's lifelong work.
It's intergenerational work, it's transgenerational work. Our kids will be picking up this work. Future will be carrying on this work.
Yeah, it doesn't happen in our lifetime, as yeah, many Black feminists have said before us. Yeah.
Mhm.
Thank you all. Thank you. Thank you for today. This was amazing. And I mean, I really enjoyed the connections that you all made. I mean, it was just amazing. Those connections needed to be made, and the way that you connect what is happening here and what is happening in Palestine, and how those things are connected and interconnected in terms of what, in terms of settler colonialism, right? So I truly appreciated all of your, all of your conversations. So I want to thank you again for being here, and know that I continue to support the work that you do on the ground, and I really appreciate it. And I'm here, in any way that I can support the work that you continue to do on the ground. And I want to thank all of our followers for tuning in today, and hope you enjoyed all of our sessions today. I thought they were quite amazing. I am truly filled, and please join us again tomorrow when we start at 11 o'clock Eastern Standard Time with two more teachings, starting tomorrow with the teaching on the Caribbean and the U.S. Occupation of the Caribbean in this very moment, and followed by, a panel on Palestine, and the idea that, that that there is such a thing as, a ceasefire, which of course we know is a chimera and it's not reality. So we'll be having that discussion tomorrow as well. So thank you, everybody, and have a pleasant evening. Thank you from everyone here at Scholar Strike for Liberation. Thank you.
Thanks, Bev.
Thank you.